Today I'll be going over Target 5. In Target 5, we're learning how to solve quadratics by a process called completing the square. The first page here, we're going to go step by step on how to complete the square. So step 1 is we always want to move the constant. Remember, the constant is the number in your equation that does not have a variable or a letter next to it, to the other side. By the other side would mean the other side of the equal sign. So 69 is my constant. I'm going to subtract 69 from both sides. So I have a squared minus 14a equals a negative 69. The second step says to take half of the middle term. By the middle term, we're always talking about our b in our quadratic. So our b is always that number that has the variable that's not squared. So it wants us to take half of the middle term. So half of negative 14 is going to be negative 7. And then square it. So I'm going to take my value of negative 7 and I'm going to square it. And negative 7 squared is 49. That number will always be positive because whether we square a positive or a negative number, we get a positive value. It says add that value to both sides to keep your equation balanced. So I'm going to have plus 49 and plus 49. Next thing it says is complete the square. This means you should have a binomial squared. So on the left-hand side here, in order to complete the square or get our binomial squared by needs 2, so I should have 2 terms that are going to be squared. So I'm going to have a parentheses with 2 things in there and a squared on the outside. My binomial squared is going to be a. We're always using the variable from our equation. And then it's going to be the value when you took half of your b term. So I'm going to have a minus 7 parentheses squared equals negative 69 plus 49 is negative 20. Now it looks like we changed this equation completely, but what you'll notice and what you're not going to have to do, but just to show you why we did this, is if I multiply a minus 7 times a minus 7, it's going to get me back to a squared minus 14a plus 49. Distributing this, I'd have a squared minus 7a plus 49. If we combine our like terms in the middle, we'd get back to that negative 14a. So I have not changed the value here of my quadratic at all. I've just rewritten it as a binomial squared. This is what we call completing the square. The next step is solving. Solving is going to go back to what we've been doing using that square root method. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides here. Remember to put that plus or minus before. So I have the square root of a minus 7 squared equals plus or minus the square root of negative 20. We take the square root to get rid of that squared. So here I'm going to be left with a minus 7 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 20. I know to get the negative out of that square root, that's the square root of negative 1, so I'm going to bring that I out. But I still need to simplify the square root of 20. The square root of 20 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. Square root of 4 is 2. So I have a minus 7 equals plus or minus 2i. We have that square root of 5 left over. We're almost done at this point. We still don't need to get a by itself, so I'm going to add 7 to both sides. 7 is not a like term with plus or minus 2i square root of 5, so I'm just going to have that in front. So a equals 7 plus or minus 2i square root of 5. And that's going to be our final answer. If you flip to the back side of the notes, we have a couple more practice problems back there to go over. So if I start with b, the first thing I want to do is move that constant to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 16 from both sides. So I have n squared plus 10n. I'm going to leave a space here equals negative 16. So in that space, remember we always have to take half of the middle number. So I'm going to do 10 divided by 2, which gets me 5. and then we always have to square that, which is 25. We add that value to both sides of our equation. Now to complete the square, I'm going to write the left-hand side as binomial squared. So it'll always be parentheses squared. Our variable here is n. It's our middle term divided by 2, which in this case was a positive 5. So I have n plus 5 squared. Equals negative 16 plus 25 is a positive 9. There we've completed the square. Now I'm going to use the square root method in order to solve that. So I'll take the square root of both sides here, not forgetting to add that plus or minus. On the left-hand side, the square root cancels out my square. So I have n plus 5 equals, the square root of 9 is 3 since it's a perfect square, so I have plus or minus 3. Last but not least, I need to subtract 5 over. On this one, we can combine those because they are like terms. We don't have that square root or I in there. So I have n equals, but we have to be careful. We're doing a positive 3 minus 5 and a negative 3 minus 5. So n equals a negative 2 and n equals negative 8. We look at C, again, we're going to start with that same step. Our first step is always moving the constant over to the other side. So v squared minus 16v. Again, I'm going to leave that space to fill in, equals negative 16. Take my middle term. My middle term here is negative 16. I'm going to divide that by 2, so I get negative 8. Before I put it in the equation, I need to square it, which gives me a positive 64. If I add 64, sorry, I wrote that wrong. If I add 64 to one side, I need to make sure I add 64 to the other side. So now I'm going to complete the square on this left-hand side. We always have our parentheses squared. Okay, when I have that parentheses squared, I take my variable, which in this case is v, and then we're always going to fill it in with this middle term once we divide it by 2. So we did negative 16 divided by 2 to get negative 8. That's what goes inside of my parentheses. That equals negative 16 plus 64. So negative 16 plus 64 is going to give us 48. Now we've completed the square, so now I'm going to start my square root method to solve. So plus or minus the square root, plus or minus the square root. I have v minus 8. I need to simplify the square root of 48. So I know the square root, or sorry, I know that 48 is 16 times 3. I know the square root of 16 is 4. I can't simplify the square root of 3, so I have plus or minus 4 root 3. Add 8 to both sides. 8 is not a like term here because it doesn't have that square root of 3 with it, so we're just going to have 8 plus or minus 4 square root of 3. Let's go down to D. So first step, always move that constant over to the other side. Now I have x squared plus 18x. I'll leave my space, equals negative 94. Take our middle term, divide it by 2, gives me 9. And then I take 9 and I'm going to square it. So 9 squared is 81. I add 81 to both sides. So complete the square. So on the left-hand side here, I'm going to rewrite that as my binomial squared. Our variable here is x. That middle term, when I divided it by 2, I got 9. So x plus 9. That equals negative 94 plus 81 is going to give us a negative 13. We've completed the square, so now we need to solve using our square root method. Plus or minus the square root. I get x plus 9 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 13. Remember, you can never have a negative underneath our square roots. We need to simplify that more by taking I out. So I have x plus 9 equals plus or minus I square root of 13. Make sure that I is coming after the plus or minus and before that square root. 13 can't be broken down into anything other than 13 in 1, so we can't simplify that. I'll finish by getting x by itself by subtracting 9. 9 is not a like term with I root 13, so we'll have negative 9 plus or minus I square root of 13. Last one we have is e. So again, first up, always move that constant over. So this time we'll be adding 77. M squared minus 4m plus something is going to equal 77. To find that something, we take our middle term of negative 4, divide it by 2. I get negative 2. I'm going to take negative 2 and square it to get 4. Make sure if you're putting that in your calculator to square it, you always put that number in parentheses with the squared on the outside. Otherwise, that's going to tell you it's a negative 4. So I have plus 4. If I add 4 to that side, I have to add 4 to the right also. Now we need to rewrite it, completing this square. So parentheses our variable, which is m. Our middle number divided by 2 was negative 2 this time, so m minus 2 squared equals 77 plus 4 is 81. Take the square root of both sides. I get m minus 2 equals plus or minus. The square root of 81 is 9. So now I'll add 2 to both sides. Remember, we have to be careful here because that means a positive 9 plus 2 and a negative 9 plus 2. So m equals 11 and m equals a negative 7. Please come in for questions to any of the Algebra 2 teachers if you need help with this.